Hello and welcome to the Hoover Institution's 2015 Southern California Conference. I'm Chris Dower, Hoover's Director of Marketing and Strategic Communications. Our speaker in this chartcast is Lee Ohanian, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor of economics and the director of the Ettinger Family Program in Macroeconomic Research at UCLA. The title of his talk is Policies to Energize the United States Economy, and it was recorded on February 3rd, 2015.
Thanks for joining Hoover this morning. I'm delighted to be here with you and have the chance to share ideas and discuss ideas about the U.S. economy. And the way I'm going to do this is really about in two steps. I'm going to show you some data on where our economy stands right now, and it's not going to be a pretty picture. And then we'll talk about some policies to try to reverse course and what the likelihood of achieving some of these policy changes are. So let me start off by just talking a little bit about economic growth, which is what economists refer to as the growth in per capita inflation-adjusted income, or gross domestic product. And the one point I want to make here is that economic growth is a result of two factors. It's productivity growth and the change in the percentage of the population who works. Now, almost all of the growth that our economy has achieved over the last 100 years, over the last 200 years, has been due to productivity growth. And productivity growth is just our name which captures innovation, business investments, investments by individuals in what economists call their human capital, their education, their skills, and their training. And this is by far and away the main factor that raises living standards. Now, on average, our economy grows about 2% per year. That is, inflation-adjusted income per person grows about 2% per year. Now, that may not seem like a lot, but because the magic of compound growth, that means our living standards double roughly every 35 years. And since 1900, we've had an eightfold increase in our living standards. There's no country that's achieved that besides the United States. No one has come close to that. Now, recently you've been hearing a lot of reports in the media and from the recent State of the Union address about the economy is recovering, and there's a lot of good news about the economy. So what I'm going to do through this talk is show you some quotes from the State of the Union address. And the President noted, after a breakthrough year, our economy is growing at the fastest pace since 1999. Well, I'm going to show you a graph of inflation-adjusted per person gross domestic product, and then you can make up your own mind about how much it's recovered. So that's the picture. The blue line is per capita real GDP, and the red dash is that 2% trend we just spoke about. And we were spot on trend up until the 2008-2009 recession, and you can see what happened. You can see that dip below. But unlike any other recession in the history of the U.S., we haven't gotten back to that red dash trend line. Now, when the President spoke about rapid economic growth, you see that little uptick right at the end of the chart? That's what he's talking about. Last Friday, which was a little too late for me to incorporate this in the slides, the latest GDP report came out, and if I was able to extend this graph, it would go back down. So that's our current economic performance, and what you can see is we're about 8% below where we should be. We have a $17 trillion economy. $17 trillion economy. So that's about $1.3 trillion per year that we're losing out because we're underperforming. Well, people also talk about employment coming back, and the President mentioned that jobs are growing at the fastest pace since 1999. Okay, well, this picture shows you employment, the number of jobs we have, and I've divided that by the working age population. And you can see employment plunged by 7% during the recession. and only recently has it been coming back up. So we were about 7% below where we should be. We've made up about 1.5 percentage points of that. We are about 8.5 million jobs below where we should be. Again, a remarkable waste of human resources. Now, the president also spoke about the federal budget, and he proposed a federal budget yesterday, and he spoke about shrinking deficits along with a growing economy and bustling industry. And I know some of you have your own companies, and later we can talk about whether you think industry is bustling or not. But let's go ahead and take a look at deficits. So I'm going to show you a picture. This is the federal debt as a share of gross domestic product that's held by the public. And you can see when the president took office, it was about 43% of GDP, and it's up to 75% of GDP today. And when people have talked about the deficit declining, well, if you look right up at the upper right-hand corner, you see that little drop? That's what they're talking about. We've never had federal debt as a share of GDP this high in peacetime. And World War II is about 110% as a share of GDP. And you can see before 2008, it was fairly stable at about 32% of GDP. Now, you know why we had this large increase in debt. It was a number of very expensive programs, such as the President's $819 billion American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. It was cash for clunkers. It was the home buyer's tax credit. It was subsidies for green energy. Now, you might have thought that we got something out of that in terms of economic growth or jobs. Well, here's that employment picture I showed you as a share of the working age population. And what I've done is I've drawn in a timeline that shows when major programs were initiated. So TARP, you remember the Troubled Asset Relief Program. And then we have QE 1, 2, 3, and 4. We have the ARRA, that was President Obama's $814 billion stimulus program. The home buyer's tax credit. You look at that graph, and it's very hard to make the case that any of those programs did much for the real economy. They certainly drove up our debt. And ironically, you don't see jobs coming back, the little bit they have, until these various programs have been wound down. Well, you know, the president kind of gave a hint as to what his policy agenda will be for the next couple of years. He talked about middle-class economics and how we should provide subsidies for community colleges and for childcare. And he said the verdict is clear, middle-class economics works. Well, you know, at Hoover, we don't really think about classes. We think about opportunity for everyone. But about as close as you can get to what the president was discussing is what we call median household income, adjusted for inflation. So if you want to see how middle earners are prospering, this is a picture. So this picture shows household income in 2013 dollars by the median household that is in the middle of the income distribution. Well, you can see how things have gone for the middle earners. They are down to a level that has not been achieved since 1989. The average household in this country, in terms of median income earnings, are no better today than they were more than 25 years ago. Now, on this chart, you'll see some gray bars, and those indicate recessions. And it's not surprising that income falls in recessions. But again, the one feature that you'll see in all these graphs is the economy is not recovering. Recovery means getting back to trend, getting back to a normal level of economic activity. Jobs have not, we're 8.5 million jobs below where we should be. GDP is not, we're about $1.3 trillion below where we should be. And this is the only time in the history of the United States where household income has not grown following a recession. You can see it grew after the 1991 recession. You can see it grew after the 2000-2001 recession. You might want to call that last little uptick at the right part of the graph, you might want to call that economic growth, but the median household is back where it was since 1989. Well, the president also talked about educational attainment. He said our younger students have earned the highest test scores on record. Our high school graduation rate hits an all-time high. More Americans finish college than ever before. That sounds great. Well, our educational attainment is declining and declining substantially. An important factor why the United States became the economic superpower it did is because we were way ahead of the curve in educating our people. Even as late as 1980, countries such as Italy, Spain, France, the average worker in those countries at that time, 1980, had completed between 5.5 and 7 years of schooling. At that time, our average worker completed over 12 years of schooling. We were way ahead of the curve in terms of education, and that's an important factor behind our economic success. Well, it's a much different picture today, and it's a grim picture as far as education goes. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development conducts every 2 years a test called the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, P-I-S-A. Take a look at it. You'll find a lot of material online. And the PISA test is given to 15 to 16-year-olds in all of the OECD countries, which are the advanced countries, the US, Canada, Western Europe, Northern Europe, Japan, Australia. And they also give it to a few other countries that aren't in the OECD, such as Slovenia and Serbia. Well, we're just not doing a very good job training our kids to be competitive in today's economy because our kids are 34th out of 44 countries in math proficiency. That's on par with test scores in Slovenia, Serbia, Uzbekistan, countries that don't have nearly the resources to spend on education that we do. We spend more than twice as much per pupil as those countries. In our state of California, only 1 in 4 15 and 16-year-olds is considered to be math proficient. Now, it's not because it's a super high bar. This test has 6 levels. A level 2 question, which is ranked by psychologists, being proficient at level 2 means you probably can handle moderate arithmetic questions and you can probably manage your affairs. A level 2 question is for students to understand 2 over 4 and 5 over 10 are the same number in a sentence. 25% can't do that. That's the level 2 question. It means 25% of 15 to 16-year-olds are going to be entering our workforce with really very little hope, very little opportunity to achieve success. Our best performing state is Massachusetts. 50% are proficient in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts kids are still 2 full grade years behind their peers in China. Our students are 4 grade years behind their peers. These are 10th graders. Our 10th graders in California on average are about comparable to a 6th grader in Shanghai, China. We have to do better, and I'll talk about some ideas to reform education in a few minutes. And how about the president's statements about college and making community college free for everybody? Well, as I mentioned, 30 years ago, we were far and away the country with the most post-secondary school education attainment. Well, we've slipped from number 1 to number 16. And how about those community college ideas? most community college students drop out. Now, these are the ones that really want to be there and that are paying and that are trying. So you want to see a really high community college dropout rate? Well, see what happens when we make it free. 28% of community college students within 6 years of entering community college receive either an associate degree or a bachelor's degree. Just 28%. The president also spoke about regulation. He says, we've put in sensible regulations, meaning DoddFrank, to prevent another financial crisis. We have a consumer watchdog to protect us from predatory lending and abusive credit card practices. Okay, I know we have some bankers in the room, and I can guess what your opinions are. This is a picture of Dodd-Frank. At the bottom, you'll see all the various types of financial intermediaries. There's consumer lending, there's broker-dealers, there's investment banking, and then up top, we see all the different regulatory bodies. There's the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is the premier part of Dodd-Frank. There's the Office of Financial Research. There's the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. And you can see the intricate and complicated and Rube Goldbergian nature of this web of who regulates what. Good luck with that working out. More concretely, I haven't spoken to one person in the financial services industry who hasn't told me financial regulation is stifling. Now, I'm not in financial services, but I can read. I didn't read all of Dodd-Frank because it's 848 pages long. I'm not sure anybody else has read all of Dodd-Frank either. Well, I can guarantee you nobody has read it all because a lot of it remains to be written. Can you imagine passing legislation that hasn't been written? Congress signs, yeah, we'll pass a law. We don't know what's going to be in it, but we'll go ahead and pass it. Now, a Yale law professor was quoted as saying, laws should provide people with rules. Dodd-Frank is not directed at people. It directs bureaucrats to make more regulations and more bureaucracies. Take, for example, what's called the Volcker Rule. Named after Paul Volcker, the Volcker Rule was initially supposed to be 12 pages out of Dodd-Frank. The Volcker Rule restricts banks' ability to make proprietary trades. It's an attempt to drive a wall between investment banking and commercial banking, as Glass-Steagall once did. There's 1,420 questions you have to answer every year, or perhaps even every 6 months, to comply with this one part of Dodd-Frank. My understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong here, but provisions 404 and 405 of the Volcker Rule costs about $150,000 the first year and then $40,000 each subsequent year to answer. It's hard to think that this is progress, and it's hard to think that regulators and policymakers think they can put together a string of oversight that will put an end to what they perceive to be socially undesirable activities by financial intermediaries. And whether we think they're socially undesirable or not, I guarantee you, this complex web nor anyone else that regulators want to put up will curb or stop or halt the issues that they wish to regulate. How about this Consumer Protection Bureau, CFPB? Well, this basically tells consumers what they can buy. It allows regulators to go after financial service firms who act in an abusive fashion, and that's a quote from the law. Well, what's abusive? Who decides that? That term has no legal meaning. There's no legal definition for a financial services firm to act in an abusive fashion. I guess that's one part that Congress forgot to fill in when they wrote the legislation. an attorney who represents some banks in DoddFrank Acts wrote, "We're living in a nanny state now. The Consumer Protection Bureau thinks they're in a better position to determine what's right for the consumer than consumer is for themselves." Now, a few months ago, I appeared as the lone economist on a national public radio show about financial regulation. And we were talking about the Consumer Protection Bureau. And I asked, if we can't trust people to make sensible decisions, and for most people on the largest and most important investment of their life, well, what can we trust them to be responsible with? And I didn't get one answer other than there's predatory lenders, there's abusive power. I said, you can hire an attorney to read this contract. Yeah, I don't know, good attorney will probably cost about $500 an hour. I don't think it'll take them more than an hour to look over this mortgage. The response was, people can't afford it. Okay, well, if you can't afford it, and you can't read and understand the contract, then maybe we shouldn't try to expand home ownership as has been done in the past. Well, what about the broader cost of regulation? You know, there's all sorts of crazy rules out there, such as Maryland won't let kids sell lemonade anymore on the street. It's harming the other lemonade sellers. Colorado has now restricted the number of crayons that can be in a box at a nursery school. Not sure what's up with that one. But, you know, moving beside facetiously, let's take a look at healthcare regulation that comes under Obamacare. Well, doctors report that for every patient hour that they provide in care requires them about the same amount of time in paperwork. We've just cut doctor productivity in half. If they're spending an hour on paperwork for every hour they spend on patient care. We've gone from 13,000 billing codes to 150,000 billing codes. And if you get injured by a parrot, I'm not sure how often that happens, they're going to have to think what code to write that under, because there's now 9 parrot-related injuries. I guess the beak can get you, or the claws, or maybe the cage hits you in the head. And God forbid you get burned by flaming water skis. But if you do, they'll have to figure out what 3 codes that goes under. Now, the Small Business Administration has estimated that regulation in our country adds about $10,000, close to $11,000 per year in costs per employee. So when we think about why haven't we recovered, why are we $1.3 trillion below where we should be? Why are we 8 million jobs below where we should be? Despite all the spending that's occurred, well, in my opinion, this is a big reason. We started out by talking about how important it is for productivity to grow. Our workers remain the most productive, and all productivity means is the value of the stuff a worker produces on average per hour or per employee in a period of time. Our economy has become great because worker productivity grows enormously. On average, it grows 2.5% per year. 2.5% per year means it doubles every 30 years. Now take a look at this graph. The blue is business sector labor productivity. This is the value, inflation adjusted, of output produced per hour by the average worker. And in manufacturing, that's over $120,000 per year. We have a remarkably productive workforce. And you see that it was pretty close to that line. The blue is the actual data, and that red dash is that trend line, about 2.5% per year. And what do you see is productivity slowed down during the recession. Not surprisingly, it typically does during recessions. But then, you see it come back. You see it start to come back right as the recession is turning around in this is early 2009. So we're kind of getting back to the trend. But then you see what's happened since then? This growth is 0.8% per year. This, between 2009 In 2014, 5-year period, 0.9% per year. Instead of worker productivity doubling every 30 years, at this rate, it's doubling every 75 years. So this is the most grim statistic I have to show you. It's one you're never going to read about in the media. I've written about it a number of times in the Wall Street Journal. If you're interested, I'm happy to send you a copy. You can go to the Hoover website and download it. The reason we are the United States and have income per capita of $65,000 per year instead of the $800 per year that we see in poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa, such as Somalia, are because our workers are remarkably productive. If we don't reverse this trend, we're going to be in deep trouble. Now you might say, well, what happened? Regulation, yes, but more deeply, it's because our entrepreneurship rate is down. Can I just see a show of hands? How many of you here started your own business? Many people have started your own business. And so you know how difficult it is and how challenging it is to risk your own capital, to work the 16 or 18-hour days that you had to work. And entrepreneurs are what creates productivity in this country and what creates jobs. Our new business formation rate is down 35% since the 1980s, down 35%. And what that statistic is just simply the number of new startups we have divided by the total number of businesses in the United States. Every state has a lower startup rate, including relatively business-friendly states such as Texas and states in the South. How important are startups? Take them away, take startups away, and in virtually every year, net employment growth is negative in the United States. Let's think about that for a second. The IBMs of the world, the General Motors of the world, the Apples of the world, the Microsofts of the world, you add them all up, on average, a year from now, they will be employing fewer people than they do today. And in 2 years, they'll be employing fewer people than they were a year from now. Startups are incredibly important for generating new ideas, which is where economic growth and productivity growth come from. So the most important innovations we've had come from entrepreneurs. The Wright brothers in the airplane, automobiles, air conditioning, the personal computer, many internet applications, electrification, the railroad, refrigeration, telephone, telegraph. I remember as a kid growing up and my mom taking out of the freezer a package of Birdseye frozen peas. Well, that was done by Charles Birdseye, who figured out a way to flash freeze food before anybody else did. He was an entrepreneur. Our entrepreneurship rate is down 35% since the 1980s and down 20%. So most of that drop has come in just the last 5 years. Well, why has it declined? We just looked at regulation. We have a much less competitive business climate today than we used to. The Heritage Foundation looks at countries and ranks them on the basis of how easy it is to start a business, to operate a business, how high taxes are, how high regulations are, how stringent labor laws are, what the judicial climate is like, how much it costs to defend yourself, how quickly you can get access in a court. The U.S. was always in the top 5. Then it kind of snuck down to the bottom of the top 10. Now we're number 17. If there's any football fans out in the audience, you know what happens if your team was perennially number 2 or number 1 or number 3 or number 4, and then you slip to number 8 or number 9, now you're number 17, you replace the coach. This is where we are. We're number 17. And you know, the city I work in, Los Angeles, is a microcosm of this. There's no city that's had worse job growth in the last 25 years, not Cleveland, not St. Louis, not Detroit, than Los Angeles. LA employment, somehow Los Angeles has managed to lose 4% of their employment base in 25 years. And we know why. Regulation's high, taxes are high, zoning restrictions are impossible. So let's talk, in my last few remaining minutes, let's talk about some policies that, in my opinion, can reshape this. Reforming tax policy, cutting federal spending, reforming immigration law, reforming education and regulation. So let me just talk briefly about these different areas. Marginal tax rates in this country are high for almost everybody. The average marginal tax rate is about 43%. 43%. So the last dollar that the average person earns, they keep 57 cents. 43%, 43 cents goes to some government entity. The highest earners in the highest tax states, I'm sorry to say we're one of the highest tax states, along with New York and Massachusetts, they're facing marginal rates of 65%. So about 2/3 of that last dollar you earn, you're keeping. I'm sorry, about 2/3 of that last dollar you earn is going to some government entity. You're keeping about 1/3. What does that tax policy look like? That looks like Western and Northern Europe, where they have marginal tax rates of over 60%. And what's sad, and when Shelby spoke earlier today about opportunities, lack of opportunities and people not accepting opportunities, well, many poor Americans face marginal tax rates in excess of 100%. Well, how can that happen? Because welfare programs and safety net programs are means tested. And a few years ago, I was a visiting professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and I was a consultant for the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. And I took the train one day a week. I took the train from where I was staying near Washington University down to the St. Louis Federal Reserve. And one day I'm sitting across the aisle from two African American women. I'm kind of a big guy, and so the trains are small. I can hear bits and pieces of the conversation. One of them said, "I got a promotion yesterday." And the other one said, "That's great." She said, "I don't know if I'm going to take it or not." And she had done the calculations, my AFDC, my aid to families with dependent children, goes down this much. My children's health insurance program payments go down this much. She had done the calculations, and she had come up with the fact that her effective after-tax take-home pay would be lower by accepting that promotion. In my opinion, I think that's just wrong. It's easy to fix those types of problems. And under every president since George Bush Sr., there's been a bipartisan tax reform commission that makes the same recommendations. Bush Sr. had one, Clinton had one, Bush Jr. had one, Obama had one. They all say the same things. It's never acted on. They all say reduce marginal tax rates, broaden the tax base. The corporate tax rate has just become a behemoth and brings in very little revenue because corporate tax attorneys and accountants are really good at figuring out how not to pay taxes. And that's not a negative statement, it's just they see a rule and their job is to figure out how to minimize the tax burden of their shareholders. So I think with the right leadership in Washington, these are reforms I think that are now possible. How about entrepreneurship? This is really the big enchilada. Well, we need to reform immigration law. We have to secure our borders, in my opinion, but at the same time, we make it very difficult for talented, ambitious, bright, young people to come here for economic reasons. We make it a lot easier for people to come here for family reasons, but not for economic reasons. Australia and Canada, they open up their arms to get immigrants who are going to start a business, who are going to make investments, who are going to become entrepreneurs. 50% of successful tech startups are done by an entrepreneur. Most are Chinese or Indian. Here's a striking statistic. 40% of the Fortune 500 were either founded by an immigrant, such as Sergey Brin of Google, or the child of an immigrant. We make it tough for these people to come here. And there are good reasons why we should have immigration restrictions, and we should be careful about who comes to the United States. But we're shooting ourselves in the foot when there are talented, skilled people who want to come here, who do graduate degrees in engineering and technology and mathematics, and they want to start a business. We make it hard for them to stay here. How about educational reforms? We spoke about how our educational system is not delivering training and skills that allow our kids to be competitive in what's a much more difficult and much more competitive workplace today than it was, say, when I was growing up. Last year, there was a court decision. A lawsuit was filed by a 13-year-old girl and about 6 other kids who were 8th graders. And they filed a constitutional lawsuit saying they were getting, in effect, a lousy education. And the Superior Court judge agreed with everything, all of their claims, and struck down teacher tenure and teacher seniority-based provisions. And that judge was quoted as saying, the evidence presented here on the failure of some teachers in some public schools is compelling, and he said, and chilling in how bad this has become. Unfortunately, Governor Brown has joined with teachers' unions to appeal this. But those who know the law much better than I do think that the kids who filed this lawsuit stand to have a good chance. And similar lawsuits are now progressing in other states, including New York. When I give talks, and I often talk to parents who are poor, they're the biggest proponents of school choice because they live in neighborhoods where they're stuck with a lousy school, where teachers are ineffective. And this is not to come down hard on teachers. Most teachers are gifted and talented and are incredibly important. A child who is lucky enough to have a teacher in the top 10th percentile of being able to teach as measured by test scores, if that kid has a top 10 percentile teacher from K through 12, their present value of income is $1 million more for their lifetime than it is if they have a median teacher. And symmetrically, if you're unlucky enough to have a teacher in the lowest 10th percentile of effectiveness from K through 12, that's $1 million less of present value of income. So when we think about those kids that can't figure out 2 over 4 and 5 over 10 are the same number, well, the research that is being conducted suggests that teachers are playing a role in this. It's not the only role, but ineffective teachers are playing a role in this case. Let me go ahead and sum up, and I'd be happy to take questions. Contrary to what you're hearing, including from the president, our economy is substantially depressed. We're losing about $1.3 trillion of income per year. We're about 8.5 million jobs short. But I'm hopeful the right leadership, we can execute some of these reforms that we talked about that I think, before the most recent elections were probably just wishful thinking. The research I've done, the research other people at Hoover have done, indicate that these reforms will stimulate entrepreneurship, investment, improve skills, and we can get our economy back on track. And let me just close by saying, despite the problems that we have in our country, we're still the best horse to bet on. Europe has an incredibly depressing scenario. Put aside the problems they have with Greek overborrowing and Italian overborrowing and Spanish overborrowing and Portuguese overborrowing, they have not had any growth in economic efficiency for 35 years. They are an old society. I don't see any easy way out for Europe. South America, they're having lots of economic difficulties. Japan has had dismal growth now for 25 years. And just as many economists predicted, a country will grow quickly up until the point that its institutions no longer will support that. China was a remarkable growth engine for a couple of decades because their institutions improved, their economic freedom improved, their civil rights improved, democracy improved. They started transforming a state-run economy to a partially private-run economy. But their institutions aren't that good, and now whenever you see a headline about slow Chinese economic growth, that's to be expected. Their institutions, as they stand now, aren't good enough to continue to grow at the rates they have. So there's another way of saying this is the world's best chance for economic success right here in the United States. And I think when you look at the stock market, part of that is the Federal Reserve's easy money policies, but I think, again, it's investors saying, well, if I don't invest here, where will I invest? So I do think these can be things that are turned around. I'm hopeful that we can get a chance to do this after 2016. Thanks so much for coming and your support. I'm happy to take questions if there's time.
Thank you, Lee.
For more podcasts from the Hoover Institution, please visit hoover.org or Hoover's channels on iTunes, iTunes U, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. I'm Chris Dower for the Hoover Institution. Thanks for listening.